All right, welcome everybody to SDRevolution Live, episode 2. Today, I'm once again joined by Grayson Fulbright, who is a master outbound sales expert and email copywriter. And today we're going to be looking at another cold email that I received that I thought was so close to being good. And again, I want to emphasize that most cold outreach, I think, is almost there to being really good and even not that far from being really great. And so today we want to look at what makes this email good, what isn't so good about it, and we'll fix it and tweak it so that you can use it in your own outreach. So the first thing I want to do, let's go ahead and read the email. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so let's take a look at this. Grayson's gone through and marked this really, really well. So here we go. Austin, I want you to picture yourself standing on the pitcher's mound of a baseball stadium. It's quiet. You look around and see 40,000 people staring back at you. The people who are wearing red shirts are, right now, in market for what you're selling. These are the people you should be reaching out to and connecting with. Not blindly prospecting from lists, trying to convince people to come into market. We'll tell you the names of the people wearing the red shirts, and we'll tell your team how to connect with them and close the deal. Are you ready to hear how we can get you those red shirts? That was the end of the email. All right. So my initial reaction when I read this email was that it was actually a pretty cool story. The first 2 or 3 lines, it earned the right for me to read it. I'll be honest, I read all of this email when I received it. The subject line was baseball. So, intriguing subject line, and it was told in a narrative format. And so I think that was really engaging. And I think that's what they did well. Where I think it goes awry is when they go and try and tell me that as a pitcher, I'm supposed to care about the people wearing red shirts in the crowd. For me, it's just not very compelling. I don't know of any pitcher at a major league level, maybe at a high school level, maybe you care about who's in the crowd, but only if you like the girl out there or your parents are there or something. Maybe scouts. But my biggest issue with this metaphor and this narrative is that it's disjointed in understanding why I, as a pitcher, would care about who's in the crowd, who's spectating. What do you think, Grayson? What do you think about this email?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I mean, you pointed out well that this is a really good example of kind of how the narrative form can catch attention. Immediately what I noticed when I looked at it is, yes, the storytelling angle is a bit odd because, they're framing it very specifically about you being on a pitcher's mound of a baseball stadium. So as you're reading it, you question, like, should I keep reading this if I don't like baseball? But what I noticed is, the way he breaks out this kind of story, it's in 3 to 5 separate lines that spaces out the email and almost makes it more engaging because it's like I'm reading it one line at a time. It's quiet. I look around and see people. This is what the people are to you. And I think he did a good job of painting the picture. Where I think it kind of goes wrong is it mixes in assumptions about the buyer with the story that they're telling. What I mean by that is, beyond whether or not someone likes baseball, what if they're like, okay, the people who are in red shirts right now are in market for what I'm selling. It's not that easy. Or maybe like, oh, like, ha ha ha, like the chance of me finding like 40,000 people in general to reach out to is like a laugh, right? They're making all these assumptions in this story. They make these assumptions that kind of makes it seem like they just understand your sales process and that it just should be easy. And I think in this situation, you got to be careful because what you're trying to convey with this story is that there are a ton of potential people out there to spend time with, and the ones that are of the highest value are often hard to find. And I think that gets lost a little bit just as he tells the story. It's engaging, but I kind of have to reread it to understand, like, okay, that's what he's saying. Like, he's saying, the story is I'm at a baseball stadium, there's a bunch of people, and I need to try to find specific people in that crowd. That made sense. And I feel like he could have
Yes,
accomplished that with far fewer sentences and with far fewer assumptions as well.
I agree with you. Now I think an important takeaway for people watching here is that formatting matters and punctuation. They use ellipses where it's important. There were like one or two spots where I was like, maybe there didn't need to be an ellipses there, but it's okay. You probably could have just used a comma, but guess what? I'm not going to destroy them over a comma versus ellipses. I get the effect they're trying to do. They want me to kind of pause while I'm reading, and it works. So if you're writing emails, and especially if you, like, I find the narrative format interesting. It was definitely different than most of the outreach I receive. That's why I remembered it. It's at least memorable. The other thing is that how you format your email is very important because it dictates to 99.9% of people that read how to read your email. That's the instruction set on how you want it read. And so as you're writing emails as an SDR or as you're creating emails for your sales team to use as a leader, however it is, be mindful of your formatting. This is a really good example of formatting used well and used to their advantage. Also, on desktop, it looks a little silly because of all the enters and that it's one line, but on mobile, it makes it easy to read. So I will say that looking at the email both on my desktop and on mobile, it doesn't offend me on desktop. It's still easy to read. I mean, it fills up almost the whole window, the preview window in Outlook. But on mobile, when I open it, it's not compact. It's easy for me to read and keep wanting to read, and the ellipses placed after it's quiet, tell me to pause. It's a very well formatted email. Whoever wrote the narrative and then did the formatting had them in perfect harmony. They worked really well together, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think kind of going beyond, the story, I think, the narrative here is good. Going beyond that, I think where they really could have improved things in general is, one, making less assumptions. Because I think even outside of the storylines, like when he's just talking, I feel like he makes some assumptions that are a little dangerous. Like, these are the people you should be reaching out to and connecting with. So he's like making a suggestion to this person who they don't know, which could be off-putting, and then immediately followed up with not blindly prospecting from lists, which that's kind of a nuanced, I think, turnoff there. Because yes, you shouldn't blindly prospect from lists. But if you're a seller, you're probably prospecting from lists. So really the terminology there makes the word blindly what they pay attention to. So when I read that, I was like, okay, well, what if I'm prospecting lists targeted? Does that mean that there's no point for me to read this email? And then I think the second piece is when he goes into trying to explain the value of why he's reaching out, I think he made a mistake of tying it to the buyer's understanding of his story. He didn't say explicitly, I can help you find in-market buyers. I can help you find and connect with those buyers. He said, we'll tell you the names of the people wearing the red shirts. And, a lot of people probably do this. I do this. Most emails, even if they're interesting, you skim them first until you realize that you want to read it more. So if I'm skimming this and I didn't really get the story and I'm trying to figure out where it's valuable to me, the only thing I'm really reading right there is, we'll tell you the names of the people wearing the red shirts, which is unclear and leaves me it leaves you in a confusing position to where it's like, oh, like, what do you mean? Do I need to go back and reread this whole email so that I understand you before I respond? And in those moments in cold outreach, you don't want people thinking about what you're saying. You want people thinking about themselves based on what you said. You should have them thinking, oh, wow, you're right. Like, there's all these people and it's really hard for us to find the right buyers. You don't want them thinking about the story and being like, oh, does this make sense? Does this really apply to me? Is this logically sound? That's a bad area to get in there. So I think overall, Alison, clarity is what I would go with here. Less assumptions, focus on the valuable pieces while still telling your story.
Sure, and I think So I really like how you, in the last episode and with this email, you talk about assumptions. And because I'm convinced that sales success, one of the bigger qualities that determines success in outbound and when you're reaching out to prospects is curiosity and eliminating the assumptions we make. Now it's important to provide context, but I think context and assumptions are two very different things. I mean, I think people need to write more context and less assumptions. But but us salespeople, because assumptions are easier to write, it takes less effort to do the research. You don't have to do any research for assumptions. You just assume. So,
Right.
you're right. I think that if instead, he makes the assumption that I'm blindly prospecting lists because that's who he's writing to, and he's writing to me. And there was another assumption you highlighted. I can't remember which one it was, but it's just like, as I'm reading it, like, you're making a lot of assumptions on how I do business. For all you know, I have a very complicated and detailed account-based marketing program, an account-based sales program, where we're not looking at lists at all. I mean, we have target accounts, and I suppose that's a list, but you know what I mean? You're causing a lot of conflict, or potentially causing a lot of conflict in a buyer. For people that are blindly using lists, they probably still don't want to admit, yes, we're blindly using lists.
And that's the thing about,
it's not a good social thing to
assumptions.
admit.
Yeah, I think that's the thing about assumptions is, like, it's all about what you make assumptions on. And what's important to remember with cold outreach is you're building this targeted list or this market, and you're building a hypothesis about a market. You're building assumptions about a market, not about one specific account and one specific person. That's personalization, and that's not an assumption. That's personalization is something you can find, like, in online, on social, something that's hardcore evidence that you can say, hey, I noticed this. That's personalization. But when it's assumptions, if you do it directly to the person, whether you're right or wrong, like you said, Austin, it can turn people off because, like, you don't know how a person is going to take a claim about something that, maybe your solution helps this problem, but because you, like, assume that this person has that problem, they're defensive, whether you're right about it or whether you're wrong about it. And so I made a post about this on LinkedIn recently. When you do make assumptions, because they're important, they're needed, because you don't always know who's qualified when you're reaching out. You don't always know who's going to be the most in market. And so what you do is make assumptions about the market. You don't say, like, you shouldn't be blindly prospecting. You should say, too many sales teams blindly prospect and they shouldn't be doing it. If someone reads that, they can think about themselves without feeling socially, like, humiliated or feel like someone's trying to, like, get them in trouble. It's more of a conversation.
Or that I've accused you of blindly prospecting.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
That's a good tip. So I think this really segues well. I'm going to jump back into the rewrite here, and I think we take a look at the better way to write this email. So immediately, so if you look, it got a little bit shorter, but I will say that the email is already pretty brief. So I mean, getting it shorter is good, but it's not a lengthy email. The length of the email is not a problem here. So I'll go ahead and read the rewrite that Grayson's prepared here. Austin, could you point out how many red-colored shirts are in a stadium with 40,000 people? Hundreds of companies are in market right now for what you're selling, but it's a continuous challenge to find these buyers and connect with them fast enough before competitors do. Sales teams often resort to blindly prospecting through lists for opportunities, which is no more efficient than shaking the hands of 40,000 people to determine whose shirt in the stadium is red. The key to sales growth is visibility. Top-tier sales organizations leverage predictive analytics technologies like our company to identify in-market buyers from the crowd in real time. Would you like to see a quick video of how this could work for new ARCs? That's awesome. So my first impression here is that like you'd alluded to earlier, the red shirt metaphor was really unclear to what the problem was that you were solving. But in this, I like that you. So the problem was in the previous email is that at the conclusion of the email, I'm like confused about the red shirt and finding red shirts in a crowd thing. But in this, it's kind of like sales judo, right? Like you lead with that. You're like, hey, I know that's a confusing concept. So hey, could you point out how many red colored shirts in a stadium full of 40,000 people? Could you do that? No one can do that. So immediately, I think we're already starting off really well here.
Yeah, to kind of go over and explain my notes a little bit. The big thing that I kind of did when I rewrote this email is fill in the pieces that I thought were missing in the story, which is why, just like you explained it, I tried to minimize the amount of time I spent talking about the story, because that's just leading buyers along. That's building momentum towards whatever they've just read last. And so instead of just putting all the story up in the front so that they have to read the whole thing and then going into why I'm reaching out and why I'm relevant, I tied the two together. And you're exactly right. I think in these situations where you're trying to use a story to get someone to a mental conclusion, you have to be really clear and you have to be really focused. And so one of the things I did, I cut out the whole baseball theme, because in my mind, my buyers, if they're looking for in-market buyers, regardless of whether they like baseball, I could ask them if they could point out this or that in a stadium of 40,000 people. They don't need to know about baseball. And I tried to use the same metaphor as the original email just to keep things fair. But I think even then, like how you actually just go about and tie a story to why you're reaching out in the first place, the faster you can do that, the better. Which is why in that second line, as soon as I kind of cue them off with a question that kind of opens up the story, I get right to why I'm telling the story. I don't even tell the story. I wait to tell the story after I kind of, what you said earlier, add context to the email. Add context to kind of why I just asked them a random ad hoc question about finding red colored shirts, and for some reason in their inbox and they decided to open. And so instead of just continuing, I really tried to focus on using assumptions. So, in those sections, the parts that are highlighted blue are assumptions that I'm making. I don't know for 100% fact that hundreds of companies are in market right now for their solution. I'm making that assumption. I actually started with the word thousands and then said, little too risky, right? And went down to hundreds just to be safe. And then, when I say that, teams often resort to blindly prospecting, I'm framing it as sales teams in general, so that it kind of sets context for when I give them that 1-2 punch of like, are you one of those sales teams that would shake all 40,000 hands, or is this not a good fit for us to keep going? And I think that's kind of the right way to loop in a story in an email, is using the narrative form to move people through the email rather than just spitting the story and then having everything else.
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about, are you the type of sales team that would shake all 40,000 hands? What's great is the ideal prospect that you want is someone who goes, oh, we're not only we're the type of team that would, we're on 9,000 to 40,000, we're still shaking. But you don't email them and say, hey, you're blindly prospecting. You make a generalized assumption, or rather, I would, instead of calling this an assumption, I would say this is a generalized conclusion of what the market is doing in general, and let them self-identify as they read, which is I think what you've done really well here. Because people who have this problem, they know how frustrating it is to feel like you're throwing a dart blindly at a target or trying to look for flecks of gold. It's called prospecting for a reason, right? Like, prospectors are like people in the California gold rush that went and sifted tons of rocks trying to get little flecks of gold. And it would be much easier if you were, sent down into a gold mine where we told, the mine shaft led to where the gold was and you just had to go drill it out. And so, you do a good job of that. And I think, if you look at the coloring where you're so what I think is interesting is that your blue is always next to yellow, right? Your assumptions slash conclusions that you make about the market or perhaps their day to day or their problem is always next to a pain point. You give them the opportunity to self-identify and then attach pain to why their current reality, their status quo is a problem, which if anybody has been in sales longer than a week knows that status quo is easily the biggest competitor. Easily. Just continue doing what you're already doing, at least in outbound.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a really good call out there because, I mean, I don't sit here and color code my emails before I send them out to people or when I'm building sequences. And so I think that really is just something I've trained myself to do over the years is, when you are kind of trying to, and I still call them assumptions, even if it is on the personalization side, it's generally some sort of claim or kind of framing about a situation, whether it be about that specific account or about a market that depends. Anytime the answer depends, that is an assumption that you're making in an email. And I think those kind of wrapping back around to what I said earlier, I think they're critical. I think you need assumptions either in a call or an email because part of these conversations is trying to hit on the right topics. And so if they're the right people, there's a likelihood that you hit on a topic that makes them go like, okay, stop, let's have a meeting. And so I think what you need to do when you make these assumptions is really focus on like you said, context rather than what you observe. You as a person are not telling the buyer what you think is true about their situation. That's very confrontational. It's a little arrogant. So what you're doing instead is you're just sharing an observation. That's why I use keywords like most, many, often, because I don't want to make these, when I make assumptions, I don't want to make these super like blanket statements that would cover everyone. I always want to leave a little room so that, if someone doesn't happen to meet an assumption, they might keep reading. And so that's why when I say sales teams often resort, I put that there on purpose because I know some people might not blindly prospect, but the list I'm targeting, the list I'm targeting hopefully is going after people that might have this problem. So it's almost kind of like a trigger point there. And the cool thing is if you back up and kind of look big picture, if I'm using that kind of like assumption to trigger my list in this specific email, I can track that on a big picture level of, oh, these types of people responded to this outreach that was talking about blindly prospecting. And I think that's something to consider too. When you're telling stories and when you're using assumptions, regardless of kind of how you're going about it with the outreach, you want to be very, very clear because otherwise you just try a script or like try an email and you can't really measure what is and isn't working about the email. Whereas if you have one kind of clear assumption and one kind of clear state of mind that you want to bring your prospects to, it's a lot easier to get them to think about their situation. Luckily, this email didn't have that problem. I think the last email we reviewed, it was a little bit kind of too much, very, very broad. And this one, that's one thing that I think this email does good about is, yes, it has some trouble like working in the story with the rest of the email, but it's so clear, it's so focused. And that's what I think was probably so attractive to you, was that it was just like, wow, like, okay, we're talking about baseball, here we go.
Sure. And so in the closing minutes, can we talk CTA? Let's
of course.
Your CTA is so the previous CTA was, are you ready to hear how we can get you those red shirts? The CTA you changed to is, how would you like to see a quick video of how this could work for new ARCs? Walk me through, what's your thought process when choosing the CTA? Because I like your CTA much better.
Yeah, so to go to the original CTA first, I think you don't want to ask questions or like put a next step out there that gets affected by how someone feels. So it's like, buyers might be qualified and like super interested for your solution, but they're tired that day, or their email inbox was overflowing, or maybe they had other priorities. So using the phrase like, are you ready? Sounds to me like a bunch of buyers are just going to be saving that email in a folder for the next time that they think about that. Whereas what a CTA is really about, right, is you put all this work into doing all this research on this type of buyer. And then you reached out to them and you want to get something moving. So your next step needs to be clear to them, but easy to do, which is why I organized my CTA like that. It's super simple. It's an opt-in CTA, like, would you like to? So if they don't, sure, I'll reach back out later. If they do, great. And then what I'm actually providing them in the CTA is something that they could just look at. It's so quick. If I said, would you like a full audit of your CRM to see the in-market buyers out there? Like, that's valuable too, but that's a big ask. They have to pull those leads out of the CRM, which is risky to give to an external person. You got to like wait, and then you have to like look through it, spend the time looking through it to see if it has results. This CTA, super easy. I just want to show you a quick video of how our solution works that you can click and watch on your own time. And I think a lot of next steps in today's outreach is kind of shifting to that, because buyers are more independent and buyers are busier. So they're not going to read an email like, "Are you ready?" and think to themselves like, like, am I ready to have this conversation? No, they're either in market and ready to talk and they're going to respond, or they're not in market and they're going to read that CTA and be like, "Nope," and move on.
Yeah, I like that. And so when I look at it, I go, yes, it's easy for me to say yes to. It puts more onus on you. And then I think it immediately, because look, if this is your initial email, I don't know where, for this person, it was the first email they'd ever sent me. So I'm assuming this is, I've never received a second email from them. But if you're preparing a sequence or something, or you're going to work a lead, I think it's a really good first email, because the people who reply and say, yes, I want to watch a video, the way you've organized your pain and attaching it to your context, your assumptions, you know that they have to be feeling some of that pain somehow. You don't know all the details, you don't know perfectly what's going on in their business. That's what the discovery call is for. But you now, of all those people that you have to send the video to, you now have a short list of people who are to some degree experiencing the pain that you're talking about relieving. So I think so it's a good CTA in that aspect. I also think that it's pretty soft. Like, it's not that much to ask to watch a video or to say, yeah, sure, I'd like to watch a video.
Yeah. And
in fact, if it was a video and the narrative was decent enough and he was like, hey, you want to watch a video on how we can do it? Just out of pure curiosity, I might have said yes. Just like, okay, how do you do that? Like, how does it work? Like, as a sales professional, because this is the thing, is I'm being sold sales stuff, I'm being stuff for sale. How are you looking at leads or determining they're in market? Even if you don't exactly tell me the secret sauce, what are your principles? What are your core values? How are you delivering the business? Are you another list vendor? Are you actually doing real data mining and have some kind of AI, machine learning, algorithm magic, that you're going to tell me about? Something, right? Just out of curiosity, I want to know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think to kind of wrap things up, last bit on the CTA, I think the great thing about soft asks in cold outreach is, like, one, usually if they respond, you're not going to immediately get a meeting anyway. So with that, sorry, I just said one and then only said one thing. So with that, you need to be able to have these soft asks to get further permission to continue. Because if you look at this from like a sales operations or like a process perspective, like, if they say yes to a video, or if they were to click a link on that video, I would want my reps to be more focused on them that day and have a totally new sequence for them tomorrow, because they're totally different from the people who are going through that same sequence and not responding and not clicking. And so I think that's really another power of soft CTAs, is it's not always going to get you a meeting, because even asking for a meeting is not always going to get you a meeting, but repeated yeses make it much easier for you to ask for more things in the future, especially if there's an exchange of value there.
Yeah, small yeses are always good, but I think, when it comes to CTAs, when can I get 15 minutes on your calendar, in SaaS especially, and I'll say in sales development in general, is so overdone. Why why does our CTA, why do our closes, why do our asks have to be 15 minutes? Well, because somewhere along the way, when SDR roles were first made up, people said we're going to pay them based on booked meetings. And I think this is kind of the problem, is that some rep along the way figured out, hey, if I ask for a meeting on every email, I book more meetings and I get paid more money. But now, we've evolved from 2010 or whenever it was. And can I have 15 minutes is a poor, dead, beaten horse. And I think the people that are, at least from some of the top sales tech companies whose cadences I watch or research or receive, their asks are different every time. Even from the same company and different SDRs, the emails are different, the CTAs are different. I think that's showing a level of customization and creativity that has not been in the sales development role in a long time. And that's why, for me personally, the two values that I look for in SDRs or a sales rep that has to do full cycle, has to prospect all the way to close, I'm looking for creativity and curiosity. Because if you're curious, you won't make assumptions, you'll ask questions. And if you're creative, you'll do what the competition and other even team members internally aren't doing, but also what the competition isn't doing. So I think being creative with the soft asks is so much more fun than begging for 15 minutes on a calendar. I feel so low status.
Every email they have the same CTA. I see that so often. They don't change it.
Like if I'm talking to you and I'm asking you, hey, would you like to see a video? I feel it's so much more fun to me because I feel like, hey, we're friends. I have something you might care about. Whereas if I'm begging for time, I feel like that's what I'm doing. I'm begging. Like I don't want to feel like I'm panhandling for time. Whereas if I'm like, hey, here's a cool article I read, or hey, here's this video that could solve something. Like if I feel like I'm being helpful, I feel so much better about my day, as a rep, as a leader, as whatever, as a human. I think we're wired as humans to enjoy helping other humans. There's something there to that, and I think the CTA is a really good example of it. So I really like it. Anyway, so I think that's all we've got time for today. I think that's about time to call it. Let's see. Unless there's anything else you want to cover, Grayson, did we miss anything on your rewrite that you want to touch?
No, I think we're good. I do know we're a little bit late here. Just make sure anyone who's watching, make sure to follow SDRevolution on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook, and then you can go to SDRevolution.com. To get more content and resources like this. Austin and I will be live every Monday, 11:30 a.m. Eastern. And so make sure to join us next week if you want to keep reviewing these emails.
Yes, and by the way, please connect with Grayson or I on LinkedIn. Send us the emails that either you receive or that you write if you want them rewritten. If you've got, if you're going into a new market and you want to say, hey, I have a template that works pretty well in this vertical, but how would I write it for this one? We're happy to give you coaching and get your templates, or I don't want to say templates, get your emails to the next level. Get your copywriting skills up, because we live and breathe this stuff. We love it.
It's true. Awesome. Well, cool. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will catch you next week.
Yep. See you next week.